From your perspective, when it comes to education, what have been some of the major lessons that we have learned so far? And what are some of those near-term implications from that we should be learning as we think about the remainder of the school year this summer, and then also potentially going into next school year?
I would say that that there's been different lessons as this pandemic has continued, and we could spend many hours on it. There's been the issue of not acting as a country together in an emergency like this in a way that every public health expert would tell you to do, which is being honest, being transparent, and creating trust. And in the absence of that, you have three real problems. You have the problem of the exacerbation of inequity, both or education inequity, health inequity, economic inequity, which has disproportionately affected people who are most at risk to begin with. Before the pandemic, 40% of Americans could not put $400 together in an emergency. Before the pandemic, 16 million kids did not have access to any kind of real speed, I wouldn't even say high speed internet. Before the pandemic, 30 million kids were getting fed every single day at school. So the pandemic upends so much of the safety net as tattered as it was that we have. And so that one of the lessons is, how do you build that back better? How do you actually not just restore what we had, but how do you actually take this and reimagine a different future because of all those inequities? The second lesson is to actually think about the resilience of Americans, and particularly American children. And that, and so I often resist the term, what are we going to do about learning loss? And try to frame it as, what are we going to do to deal with the effects of COVID on kids and on their futures? The instructional effects, the academic effects, the emotional effects, the social effects, knowing full well that so many kids have more resiliency than any of their adult counterparts could have imagined, given everything that has happened here, particularly the corrosive effect of all this isolation. So separate and apart from the illness and the death and being scared about, whether mom has a job or what's going to happen in terms of will we get evicted or not. But it's the basic lack of we're social creatures and that isolation. And how do we then, because of the amazing resilience of children, regardless of who they are or where they come from, how do we patch into that and actually create a joy and a confidence instead of continuation of a message that says, okay, see how much you've lost? Now we're going to put you into remediation. Let's reframe that in terms of what we need to do about joy and honoring that resilience. And like we've in some ways done when veterans came home from a war, and honor that and honor what we've then be able to do. And the third lesson for me is the absolute heroic, Herculean effort of people who have changed virtually everything they've done. I have the honor of representing over 200,000 healthcare personnel, where our union is now the second largest nurse union in the United States, and we're the second largest teachers union. And so we have seen people whose lives are completely upended themselves turn on a dime in a period of time where the pandemic response has been based on incompetence and lies, try to figure out how to engage kids, how to feed kids, how to protect people, often without the necessary protections themselves. And as much as they know that this is unsustainable, and as much as they know that they want to be back in school working with kids, because in school learning, in relationship, in community is absolutely essential, they have done everything in their power to help calm a nation, protect a nation, feed a nation, engage a nation, particularly its kids. And that heroism on a day-to-day basis is so amazing to me. And all of the kind of attempts of those who try to pit nurses against doctors, teachers against parents, my anger is that how dare you pit people against each other in a pandemic, which we're still only learning the true nature of it. So the lessons I've learned is about the character of America in the midst of such great tragedy and such great inequity, how you see huge resilience and huge compassion about who the people are who have been the essential workers and the helpers, as Mr. Rogers would say,
Right.
and who our children are.
This is about a community infrastructure that serves the whole need for the children. So I guess my next question then is, as President-elect Biden, he's prioritized this idea of a safe reopening of schools by the end of the first 100 days. When you think about that in context of all of that, what would be required from not just an administration, but from all of us in order to make something like that happen? And is that achievable?
We need to have those safeguards, those mitigation efforts, and they need to be clear and transparent. That includes things like masks and social distancing and cleaning and ventilation. But if we're going to have the kind of not knowing what's going on with these new strains and things like that, we need to layer one more mitigation strategy, which is the early warning system of testing. 40% of COVID travels asymptomatically. And even though we know, because of the testing that has happened, that the rate of transmission, the mitigation strategies have very effectively helped in elementary schools reduce transmission. We don't really know what's going to happen with this new strain. We don't really know what's going to happen in terms of this surge. So making sure we can have this early warning system and clear measures for what trigger opening and closing of schools, like frankly the private schools are doing right now, that's going to be something important as well. So I would call that mitigation and early warning. Three more things we need to do. We need to make sure that we are using that there's two fights we have here: the fear of disinformation and the science. And so to deal with the fear, whether it's a fear of a vaccine or whether it's a fear because somebody is at risk, we need to be really good about reasonably accommodating those who are at risk, them or their families. We do that with kids and parents all the time by saying, do you want in-school instruction? Do you want remote? We need to do that for teachers as well and for other school employees as well. Fourth, we need to prioritize that if we are prioritizing schools, in-school learning for kids, then we need to prioritize vaccinations for educators after healthcare workers and those in nursing homes. And unfortunately, with the piecework, patchwork process that we've had since COVID has started, it's going to become as cash can. The Biden administration needs to help make that a priority for educators and align it with the schools that we're opening. And the last thing is this: any superintendent or any of us who've been around education for a long time will tell you, these are a lot of moving pieces. You're dealing with an invisible virus that has significant, that you can mitigate, but has significant effects if it's not mitigated. So the places, and the the education secretary designee is really good at this. The places that have worked together, that have what you call a situation room or a labor management context or whatever, those things would be really good. That collaboration would be really good. So that's kind of the basics. But frankly, if we don't also then use this opportunity to wrap services around schools, to really think about how to plan a second semester, to actually really make sure that we're meeting the needs of kids, to have the guidance counselors, to have the nurses, then we're going to lose a real opportunity for kids to thrive. But really, truly, also making sure we are wrapping services around and we're really meeting the needs of parents, of kids, and of educators. That's what creates the trust that will make this enduring, given that we really have no idea what's around the corner until a vaccine fully protects America.
That's right. And you think about, because what in essence you're talking about is how do we have a holistic buildup?
Exactly right.
How do we make sure this build up, because the breakdown on so many fronts, we have seen that in so many cases by the decisions that were made, and by frankly just an extraordinarily lackluster federal response, that our children and the families were not a priority in terms of how this was going to take place. And so as we're talking about the holistic buildup, when you're thinking about the new Secretary of Education elect, so much of this is about how are we rethinking systems, teams, structures to make sure that things that were not very high on the priority list are now getting moved up on a priority list. What advice would you give specifically with the idea that this is not just simply about one element of what we want to address, but how do we think holistically about making sure that this is not a lane, but actually a lens in the way that we're putting together our approaches?
So, look, I've known Dr. Cardona since he worked as a principal in Meriden. We represented the educators in Meriden, and we started an innovation fund, I don't know, about a decade or so ago. And Meriden was the first, we required grants to go to locals that were working in collaboration with their management. And Meriden was the first place we worked. And so we've known Dr. Cardona for a long, long time. He understands that it takes a village and that you have to solve problems. And that, and if you know him at all, his life story is the American dream.
Yes.
And so he sees opportunity where others may see challenge. And he sees, he sees, yes, we can, where others wonder whether they can, deal with the obstacles. Mm-hmm. And so, but he does it in a way that's very pragmatic, and that is very much done through a lens of equity. So I think what he'll do operationally is really work with people and bring people together. And I've had conversations with some of the superintendents I know well about how we need to help him. And I know that NEA feels the same way, and NEA and AFT have been working working well together. And during this whole process, Becky and I talk to each other frequently. We don't even bother saying hello anymore when we, we just run right into a conversation about whatever we're talking about. But that's, I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but that's a sign of
that's right.
Us really working together. And so, but we'll have to find ways of pulling all of us together and of making sure that people don't feel like this year has created huge loss academically for them. What I worry about is that there will be a failure to remember that we've just gone through what will be a year of dislocation, and that in a few months from now, people will forget that that has happened, and will want kids to be in exactly the place they should have been in if it had not happened, because that's going to put huge pressure on the people who are closest to kids as well as the kids themselves.
Mm.
So I think we have to, that's why I keep talking about how do we create a goal of how do we deal with the academic, the social, the emotional needs, and think about this summer to next year as a year of not just healing, but a year of learning, a year of engagement, and a year of really pulling ourselves together again, because we've just been through a war.
Yes.
And I think that's going to be Dr. Cardona's challenge, and that's going to be Joe Biden's challenge. And I think what we'll see is, as if we can actually create the trust and agency to do that, so that people can see we are really working to make sure we're making kids a priority. We are, also dealing with the stress and strain that teachers and communities have faced during this period of time, and that people are actually operating together. I think that's going to be very helpful. Obviously, it's going to take systems work. It's going to take resources, but it's also going to take best practices. And the Department of Education can be a clearinghouse for those best practices, both on a systems level as well as on an innovation level.
And you're right, where we can't look at it almost in this sense of reflection or in retrospect, because we're still in it.
Yeah.
We're still in the middle of everything we're talking about right now. I mean, I think about, in this moment that we're talking now, or just earlier today, Dr. Fauci says, he predicts, we could be looking at an October, November sense to a return to normalcy, which if that is correct, it means we're almost halfway done.
Right. And that's why, and that's why I don't mean to interrupt you. That's why, if you think about where we were last September and October, we were in a better situation than we are in some ways right now. No one really knows on this side of the pond what the transmissibility or the virulence is of this new strain. Right. And whether or not the vaccine will work on it. But my point in saying all this is that if we're honest with each other and create trust and agency, that we're all in it together, and don't go from denials to magical thinking, right, but go from the denials to we're all in it together, and what do we need to do to protect people's lives, but also make sure that the effects of COVID don't continue to to terribly hurt children. Yes. How do we work together to find these ways of operating? That's something that I think Dr. Cardona has the muscle for. I think that Dr. Biden wants to do, that the vice president-elect wants to do, the president-elect wants to do, but it's going to require us creating that infrastructure to do that. So things like community schools, yes, help create that infrastructure. Things like, what are we going to do for vaccine distribution? What are we going to do over the summer? How do we share good strategies? So I'm excited about planning in a time that's like no other. And we're going to have to work together and come up with solutions that then people buy into and people feel are doable. So it may look different, Wes, than either you or I are thinking about right now. It may be that kind of working together will come up with something that none of us have thought about yet. Mm-hmm. But it's the work of working together, knowing full well, I'll go back to the lessons from the beginning, the resilience and the fortitude of children and the need of all of us to help protect their and make sacrosanct their future, but also the amazing goodwill and Herculean efforts and dedication and compassion of the educators and the other frontline essential workers.
Amen.
That's an alchemy that if we have the resources and we figure out the strategies, that's going to be amazing.
You actually you touched on something that I actually wanted to wanted to lean in on, because I think it's an important point, because whether we're talking about Dr. Cardona, whether we're talking about Dr. Biden, whether we're talking about the president-elect or the vice president-elect, so much of how we're thinking about education also, it's a federalist conversation, right? It's governors, it's state legislators, it's people on a very local level who will receive support and guidance from Washington. But what happens in Mississippi or Washington State or New York State or Maryland is very much going to be led by who is sitting in state houses and the legislators and how they want to put their process as to how they're thinking about this reinvention and protecting our children and our families in ways that they are not being protected right now.
Exactly.
What counsel and advice would you give to advocates, supporters, families who are saying, what conversation should I have with my governor or my state legislator? Because in many ways, how they're talking about it and how they're thinking about it is going to have as much influence on what happens in my classroom or in my school or in my district as the conversations that are taking place in Washington, D.C.
So look, the Department of Education is not the school board for 16,000 districts.
Exactly.
The school board for 16,000 districts are the school boards for those 16,000 districts.
Right.
And unfortunately, what the federal government should be doing is creating guardrails and guidance and resources. And then when we have best practices around the country and strategies that seem to work, to be able to disseminate those things. That's what it should be doing. And of course, because the education department is a civil rights organization as well, we have to make sure that those who have the least get the most, and that we're not leaving people behind, particularly kids at risk, kids who are vulnerable.